All right. Good morning, everyone. Good morning, the audience here at the ODI Global Room in Westminster, but also a warm welcome to everyone online. And there are quite a few people have joined us online today for this meeting, which has a sort of a global. It's a global topic. We are going to talk about pathways from debt crisis to transformative growth. And I say it's a global topic because this is likely to be relevant for all regions in the world. It's going to be really important to have insights from around the world. We know that debt has increased dramatically, and in many cases it's now sort of at record highs, at least in value terms. But what is also important to note is that debt service levels have increased dramatically over the recent 5 to 10 years, and been ongoing for some time in some of the poorest countries. And we're seeing these crises, debt crises, around the world, and we think it's very important that there is a sustainable solution for this, that countries do address the challenges and come out of a crisis, that they can not only stabilize their situation, think about their debt situation, that they stabilize it, that they stabilize the economy, the macroeconomy, but also that they then come out of the crisis in a better way, and what we call transformative growth, that they really focus on economic transformation, that they raise their productivity, that they're able to think not only about more exports, but also better exports, and that they then are in a better position to withstand other shocks and further crises. That's a tall order for many countries, and we'd like to discuss experiences from around the world, and we have a stellar panel to discuss the issues. So we are going from my left first, immediate left first. We have Professor Stephanie Griffith-Jones, who has just returned from Chile, where she was the deputy governor of the Central Bank of Chile, and when we think about countries that are managing shocks really well, then we think about Chile. And so we'd like to learn from Chile. And in particular, we get insights from Chile, from you, what's happened over the last, say, 5 to 10 years, and also when you were in charge of as being a deputy governor of what's happened in Chile, and what are the lessons for that. We then go to further to the left, and there's Dr. Ganeshan Vishnaraya, who is a senior visiting fellow at ODI, and is leading a project in Sri Lanka on this topic. So how to go from debt default, from debt crisis to transformative growth. And there are a range of publications that we've co-edited on this topic. I've got a copy here, but it's goes online, individual essays that we've brought together. And also he's highlighted the need for a growth strategy to come out of the crisis, and a transformative growth strategy. And there's a growth report as well, and no doubt we'll talk about that in greater detail. So, and perhaps you can also bring in some of the other Asian experiences as well. So think through how well is Sri Lanka coming out of the crisis, because it faced a major default in 2022. And then further down to the left, we've got Phyllis Papadavid, who is a senior research fellow at ODI, and she will be talking about the case of Greece. And everyone here in Europe will remember the case of Greece, and the long drawn-out case of Greece. It went on and on and on, and we'd like to know a little bit more about what happened in the case of Greece, what are the lessons from Greece. And also, are there now some green shoots as well, so that there are some areas of hope after maybe 15 years of crisis. And then we have Andrew de Baron online, who is Chief Economist for the Africa region at the World Bank. And so in previous meetings, we've had sometimes presentations by the IMF, which is also, of course, very important. And we do want to discuss the role of the IMF during crisis. And I'm told that also, I think even Chile was involved with IMF in recent times. So IMF really important, and to think about the appropriate role of the IMF in and during crisis and how they can help the path getting out of the crisis. But I think it's also very important to think about the more structural transformation, thinking about the transformative pathways through which countries need to come out of the crisis. And there we'd like to hear insights from the World Bank and also think about the World Bank's approach to this topic. And so this, I think, is not just going to be an academic discussion, it's rooted in practice. And I'm also reminded by one of my former directors at ODI, he always said, what are you going to do on Monday morning? Well, thank you for coming here Monday morning, addressing this meeting, or coming to the meeting and attending it. That's your thing to do on Monday morning. But I think we also want to hear from you all, from the panelists, some practical lessons that countries can take home and think through and say, oh, okay, this is really important for managing a crisis, or thinking about how you come out of the crisis. So it's really good to also hear from Andrew when he comes online on African countries as well. And that's also where we are at ODI as well. We're very interested in sort of thinking through. We work with a range of African countries to think through this topic as well. So after this introduction, let us now go to the introductions by the speakers. And we have about 7 to 8 minutes, or 8 to 10 minutes, I think I gave you in terms of introductions. And we'd really love to hear from you, first of all, from you, Stephanie. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Dirk. So the first point, I'm delighted to be here. Also, I'd never been here before in this new ODI headquarters, which are very impressive. So congratulations for that. And always delighted to be here with, thank you very much, Dirk, for the invitation. So my first point I want to make is that Chile is a bit different from the other cases in the sense that we didn't start luckily from a point of debt crisis or debt overhang, at least not from public debt. I will refer specifically to the period when I was on the board, which coincided more or less with the period of the Boric government, which is just finished. But we didn't start from a debt crisis. The last debt crisis that Chile had was in the early 80s. And I think one of the interesting things is that they seem to learn quite well the lessons. Not all countries do, but I think they did learn the lessons of the need for prudent bank regulation, for the need for macroeconomic balances, and so on. And this is, I think, quite broad from across the political spectrum, from left to right. But like much of the global economy, Chile experienced a series of macroeconomic shocks over the past 5 years. First, it faced the supply chain disruptions internationally associated with the pandemic, as well as the need to restrict workers' movements for COVID prevention, higher global commodity prices, especially for energy and food, triggered by the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and then more recently, the uncertainty generated by global tariff policies. So there was a series of international and sanitary shocks. And on top of this, there were also purely domestic factors. The first one being the massive injection to domestic demand resulting from large pension fund withdrawals, as well as the very large fiscal response to COVID. And secondly, the subsequent unfreezing of electricity tariffs, which had been frozen since 2019. So when the pandemic started, the Central Bank of Chile responded by cutting the policy rate to its minimum level to provide liquidity and sustain aggregate demand. At the same time, fiscal policy introduced a large-scale direct transfer program known as Emergency Family Income, which actually was not targeted, and so it was very broad. In parallel with these measures, and because the fiscal measures had been a bit quite slow in starting, Congress approved 3 early withdrawals from the private pension savings funds. And these latter 2 measures, the fiscal and the pension withdrawals, were very large in proportion to GDP, even in comparison for international, very large. And this transformed effectively long-term macro savings into immediate consumption in a context of severe supply constraints, which boosted at the same time domestic demand levels to levels far above the economy's productive capacity. So by the end, just to give you a sense of the scale, by the end of 2021, private consumption was 50% above its mid-22 level. So within a year, a bit over a year, private consumption went up 50%. I think the import of cars doubled during some months. As a result of this expansion, Chile recorded major twin deficits, a very large fiscal deficit, and a current account deficit that came close to 10% of GDP during 2022. With domestic demand running so high and compounded by the logistical problems posed by COVID and the big cost shock of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, inflation rose steadily. So that was when I was arriving. In August 22, headline CPI reached 14.1% over a year, which is way above what the average inflation had been in Chile for a long time, which was around the central bank target of 3%. Addressing this structural imbalance required a very sharp macro adjustment, and the central bank began a tightening cycle, raising the monetary policy rate all the way to 11.25 by October 22, which was way above what it had been in COVID times, which is very little above zero. And this restrictive stance remained till July 23, and it helped the output gap to come down gradually. This was accompanied by fiscal consolidation. During 2022, the incoming Boric government carried out a 23% contraction of public spending in real terms, reflecting basically the withdrawal of these extraordinary pandemic-related transfers, but also, if you like, prudence of spending on social sectors, which they would have liked to have increased. This synchronization between monetary tightening and fiscal consolidation was the key factor in preventing some kind of long-term de-anchoring of inflation expectation, because central banks don't look just at current inflation, they look at projections, but also how the market and other actors in the economy perceive future inflation expectations. And when they're anchored, they feel much more relaxed. By March 24, the adjustment process was already producing good results. Inflation came down to just above the 3% target, and inflation expectations were already continued anchored. And interest rates had come down to 7.25, and the central bank's communication was saying that likely further reductions would continue as the macro context would continue to improve. However, a new domestic shock materialized, the unfreezing of electricity tariffs, which had been frozen since 2019 because there had been a so-called social explosion, a big social unrest. And then they were frozen, and this major adjustment had very large increases which were phased in household and companies' electricity bills, which directly affected CPI. But it was interesting, I think the central bank explained that headline inflation would temporarily pick up, revising its short-term forecast, but that it explicitly based its policy decisions on underlying inflation. Central bankers look a lot at what we call underlying inflation, what normally is called core inflation, which is not subject so much to volatility. And since this core CPI, excluding these volatile components, was continuing to decline, the central bank continued its monetary normalization process. So it said these are temporary shocks, and provided they don't spill over to the rest of the economy, we think that it should not affect the medium-term forecast. Central banks look, at least in the Chilean case, at 2 years. They want to reach the target, which is 3% in the case of Chile, in 2 years. This approach helped stabilize the outlook by 25, when inflation prospects were increasingly favorable, and that helped absorb all the volatility of the new shock that arose, which was the announcement of new tariff policies by the Trump presidency. By early 2026, February, inflation was well below the 3% target. In fact, it was 2.4% the last reading. Unfortunately, I had just left, so I couldn't be celebrated. The inflation convergence took place while maintaining positive economic activity. It was low the first year, 0.7% growth, but in 24, it expanded to 2.8%, and 25 closed with growth of 2.5%. And positively also, in 25, gross fixed capital formation was growing quite fast, by 7% in 2025, driven mainly by investment in machinery and equipment, particularly in mining, but also in energy, particularly renewable energy. At the same time as growth recovered, the central government's public debt stabilized after years of continuous increases and reached 42%, less than 42% by the end of 25. And the financial markets internationally recognized Chile's fiscal credibility as reflected in sovereign spreads that remain among the lowest in emerging markets and lowest by far in Latin America. Alongside the economic cycle, there have also been positive developments in structural indicators, which is more the area that Dirk highlighted. GDP per capita increased, partly because population growth is slowing down, rising above the averages observed during the previous decade. So GDP per capita grew in 1.3% in the last 4 years, 0.8% in the previous one, and 0.6% in 2014-2017. So actually GDP per capita was increasing. The latest poverty survey data, perhaps particularly important, show declines in poverty levels to 4.9% in 24, below what they were in 22 and significantly below what it was in 2020. And this was due partly precisely to the fact that the lowering of inflation protected the real incomes of lower income households, as did the significant increase in the real minimum wage. The National Commission for Productivity indicated that total factor productivity started increasing for 2 consecutive years, 24 and 25, reversing previous trends of stagnation. So there, the increase in investment, the increase in productivity, total factor productivity gave some hope for increased growth in the future. And what are the lessons that Dirk asked us to focus on? The first one was that Chile started from a quite balanced macroeconomic situation, low levels of debt, low levels of fiscal deficit, which helped, low levels of inflation. But the main lessons once you are in a crisis, I think was, and here I sound a bit conservative, but it is the central banker's point of view, is the need for a timely monetary response to excess aggregate demand. Acting quickly to tighten credit conditions prevents inflation expectations from becoming the anchor and reducing thus the future social cost of economic adjustment. I would add, and not necessarily all my other central bank colleagues, this is off the record, that also rapid reduction of interest rates once inflation shows a clear trend of declining is equally desirable, because then you minimize the cost of adjustment. Secondly, the usefulness of forward guidance in the face of supply shocks, because we distinguished quite clearly in communication terms the temporary impact of supply shocks such as electricity tariffs increases from the dynamics of underlying inflation. And this is valuable, though it's difficult, because it's difficult in the bad times when you have this big shock to know whether it will spread to the rest of the economy, but you can make educated guesses. Third is the critical importance of coordination between fiscal and monetary policy. because macro stabilization was successful because the fiscal contraction of 22, combined with the central bank's restrictive interest policy initially, worked effectively on aggregate demand. Though there were, of course, debates about scale and timing of the adjustment, there was fairly broad consensus that the adjustment was carried out without unnecessary cost to the real economy. Because it's as important to lower inflation quickly, but do it with the minimum cost to the real economy. Of course, important challenges remain, such as restoring dynamism in formal job creation and promoting higher growth, as well as structural transformation. However, the implementation of these coordinated, technically grounded policies showed it is possible to navigate periods of severe global and domestic shocks while restoring macro balance, which is a necessary but not sufficient condition for sustainable and inclusive growth.
Great, thank you. Excellent insights, really, really brilliant. And I think so. You highlighted a couple of actions and also lessons, and that well, you've been successful also in sort of coming out of the shocks that you faced, and actually you pointed to some structural transformation indicators, also GDP per capita, for example, and some really useful lessons that we can discuss. One thing you talked about was maybe just one quick question there is about coordination between monetary and fiscal policies, and I think we all would think that that's important. But how does it work? Can you tell us a little bit about how that works in Chile?
Well, it's interesting what you say. I mean, the institutional arrangements, for example, were in Chile that the finance minister has voice but not vote in the board decisions. So he comes in the morning, we give our opinions, the staff presents, we give our opinions, and then he gives his opinion, and then he politely leaves, and we decide. Yeah. In other countries, for example, in Colombia, the finance minister actually chairs the central bank board. So there is a more, if you like, direct coordination. Yeah. It's quite different. And there is a regular dialogue, but the central bank is very autonomous. Yeah. And it values its autonomy greatly. But there are regular meetings between the president of the central bank and the staff, as well as the finance minister. Okay, well, it's an important topic, I think, to discuss. I think it's very interesting. Yeah, it's about sort of the mandate of the central bank often is price stability, exactly. But they're also key economic advisors to often the president or head of state. And exactly. Do they have an interest in? They have an interest, but do they have a mandate to work on growth and transformative growth? I think there's an interesting issue there that we discussed before, which is whether central banks should have also a mandate for full employment, as the Fed does, or growth. Yeah. Which I think is an interesting discussion. Yeah. Okay, let's discuss it. Let's now turn to Ganesh for the experience of Sri Lanka. How well did Sri Lanka do?
Thank you very much, Dirk, and it's always a pleasure to be at ODI in this wonderful setting. Sri Lanka, I think, is interesting and different to Chile in the sense that our debt crisis and default is very new. It was 2022, April, May that we defaulted. And so we're kind of a latecomer, and the whole crisis is still ongoing. And we're in the midst of an IMF program. And this is a middle income country. The per capita income in 2025 is about $5,000. And Sri Lanka is also interesting because it was Asia's first defaulter in the 21st century. So it has all these interesting elements. And in 2023, we got an IMF program. And late 2023 to about 2025, you see an uptick. We go from an economy that's contracting with poverty that doubles to half the population, or 25% at least, depending on how you measure it. You have inflation that goes to 60, 70%, and then sort of comes, and then inflation is there, and foreign reserves are 25 million the day we defaulted. So it really was quite a dramatic change. And then it turns around, and today you have growth of 5% in 2025. You have inflation down to about 3%. Reserves are practically 7 billion, and poverty is still high. right? So that's the kind of scenario we're in. Now, there are kind of four things that may be useful in terms of lessons from this kind of ongoing story. The first is that stabilization can work with money and pragmatism. I think that's the first kind of thing that I want to bring out. And so this V-shaped recovery we've had is supported by some external financing plus some political continuity. External financing wasn't very much. It's about 10 billion, shall we say, that came to Sri Lanka, 3 billion IMF program, some MDB money, 4 billion from India, which was an important factor in this. A first responder when we didn't have the IMF program. And then the central bank played a very important role, very much like what you're saying. They did very prudent macroprudential policy. There was stress testing of the banks to stop a secondary crisis, right? Because the bank crisis usually comes after a default. And there was a very strong proactive interest rate policy. There was rising interest rates to get rid of inflation. And then on the down, as the economy recovered, they've been pushing interest rates down. So that's very clear. And then we had a very interesting political change. We had a left-leaning government. I think they still have a Marxist-Leninist flag outside their headquarters. So that's fascinating, again, with Chile and the history that you have. But they were very pragmatic. They continued the IMF program of the predecessor who actually got that done. And so stabilization of the IMF style can work with pragmatism and some money. So that's lesson one. Lesson two, I think, for me, is really that you have a modern monetary policy framework with a central bank that goes from a sort of a development bank that many people talked about. It tried to attract investment at one time. It was trying to do the employment story. It was trying to do everything, basically, in the Sri Lankan context in the old days. And also what they call homegrown solutions. This is in the default period, to a central bank that's now very much under a flexible inflation targeting framework with a target of 5%, a strong emphasis on independence. So the Treasury Secretary used to be on the board, no longer so. There's a new Central Bank Act. And they have been pretty independent and also an advisor to government. So I think that's been a crucial function because the economic capacity in the rest of the system has been weak. So a modern monetary framework with an independent central bank is important. Where they probably need to do more, I think, is on the financial regulation, particularly in financial inclusion issues. There are some questions around whether the banks are making monopoly profits and so on and so forth. But that's a second important lesson. The third lesson I think is very interesting is this whole debt restructuring question. And I'm led to believe that it's very complicated in mix, mainly because you have this very diverse creditor base, right? And that poses lots of challenges to coordination and trying to get a deal amongst these different creditors. And now debt restructuring story was complicated because we had China as an important creditor. I think it's the largest bilateral amongst the ones we've had. And also there are some geopolitical issues around that. And because we were a MIC, the common G20 framework for debt treatments was not possible. And, they bring them together. But they did a kind of a very interesting informal coordination amongst these different creditors. And that I think was very interesting, chaired by France, India, and Japan. And China informally coordinated with them, and there were regular discussions with private creditors. Although one decided to sue, one private creditor decided to, Hamilton Bank decided to sue Sri Lanka, and I think there are still some discussions. Outcomes are possibly mixed from that. There was some debt forgiveness. I think 3 billion in debt was forgiven, 3.7, I think, if I remember right, and another 25 billion was restructured. And we extended repayment terms over 2 decades at lower interest rates. And then there's this instrument macro bonds that came around and linked to growth and governance. So there are upside things and downside things depending on your performance. But even after all of this, the debt to GDP will still probably be 95% by 2032, according to the IMF calculations, and that ratio, falls a bit from 128 when we defaulted the public debt to GDP, right? So we really need a new debt treatment process for market access countries. And I think you've been talking a lot, Stephanie, over the years about how this stuff works, and we can get into in the chat. And a lot of capacity building on debt restructuring. That's another thing that I'm reading. Lesson 4 is, I think, the structural change one, right? So there was a lot of celebration last year in Sri Lanka that we'd stabilize the economy. And, it's basically a cyclical recovery, right? You're down, a base effect, you reduce the interest rate, there's money in the system, and the thing grows. And also we got rid of import controls, which was another factor in this macro story. And the government probably faced some criticism regarding the slow pace and hesitation of structural reforms. And remember, this is a left-leaning government that has ideological debates within it, I think, about reforms. And this criticism, I think, is only partly true, because they did adopt the IMF program with these 4 interesting laws around Central Bank Act to give independence, a Debt Management Act that brought the central bank's function of debt management with the finance ministry, and they've got a new office, fiscal prudency is there. And then they've done a few things, a lot of emphasis on digitization of public services, breakup of the Central Electricity Board, committee to look at FTAs, which is very recent. But the question really is, does the government lack the state capacity to do reforms? And that's a big question that we've been looking at. Now, as 2025 came, and this is an ongoing story, right? So we got hit by the Trump tariffs, of course, which you mentioned. But I think the more important one was Cyclone Ditwa. So we had a big cyclone that came in November, December 2025. So literally, 2-3 months ago, that the World Bank estimates had a hit of something like $4.1 billion. 4% of GDP was the shock in terms of damage. And then, of course, the Iran war, which I think is really a big ongoing challenge. And that's going to have, I think, a big risk in terms of fuel price rises. And with inflation, and I think this 5% target may be under stress as we talk. And then there is also, of course, the opportunity from that. Dubai, Qatar, Bahrain, and even Saudi were seen as safe havens, right, for money and people across the world. And the Middle East was very much a key regional hub, right? Now, Sri Lanka has an opportunity to become a kind of a hub for money and people. And we have a port city financial center, which needs work on. And that could be one story. And also we are trying to be an airline hub. Recently, there was some interest in our second airport being a hub for the Middle East Airlines, and there's a conversation going on. But all of this notwithstanding, there needs to be a big thrust on trade, which is the work that we are hoping to do, particularly on regional trade with India. And we did this really interesting growth study, which kind of made a big case. And the new work that we're doing is trying to talk about how Sri Lanka integrates regionally with India. And we're trying to produce some work. So in summary, Sri Lanka is an ongoing story. I think personally a fascinating story, because it's sort of happening as we speak. Stabilization with pragmatism and some money. Debt restructuring that's very difficult. But they managed to do a pretty heroic effect, because all the donors and China as well, and the creditors managed to sort of play in the right direction. Central bank, which played a key function in all of this, led by a very charismatic governor who was brought out of retirement to kind of lead this effort. And then the last point, slight blemish, is this kind of lack of a proper reform momentum. So I don't think that we should really be doing big bang reforms as a big way forward. And this is ongoing, and I think Sri Lanka's story is to be told, and the Iran war in particular, on top of Cyclone Ditwa, will be a major thing we have to deal with. Thank you, Doug.
Thanks, Dan. It's also very fascinating, the ongoing story of Sri Lanka, and you highlight sort of the V shape, which is remarkable as well. And if you think about other countries, where there's more like an L shape, I would have thought, that with lots of debt and not getting out of the crisis. So Sri Lanka's done really well there. Nonetheless, there are some challenges, and so you highlight that debt to GDP still very high, and there needs to be more work on reform and trade. The story about the central bank and the role of central bank was also written up by Chandranath, the deputy governor, central bank, in a macroeconomics briefing, which is edited by the series edited by Phyllis Papa David. So Phyllis let's move to you. I mean, you gave a seminar which was chaired by Chandranath at the time, and I think one of the things we thought was don't be a Greece because the crisis takes such a long time, and you don't want to wait 10 years before you get to see any green shoots. But we want to hear a bit from you on the case of Greece and any other cases, international cases you think are important on how to manage debt and then have that pathway towards transformative growth. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So from a European perspective, and actually from a global perspective, Greece's crisis was unprecedented in many ways. It was very, as you mentioned, Dirk, long and protracted. And I think if we look over the span of the decade of the crisis that we had, the one key thing that's been communicated to me by former policymakers that were involved with the crisis was just, you mentioned, Ganesh, about pragmatism. It was just the lack of realism around the fiscal multipliers just initially. And so there was a vast underestimation of the impact that austerity would have on the economy and on growth. And from peak to trough, the economy in the end contracted 25%. So there was a 25% contraction in GDP. And just in the midst of that dynamic, the negative growth dynamic actually worsened the debt position and then called for more, necessitated more austerity, and then actually contributed to the recessionary pressures even more. So there was a very negative feedback loop that happened with the Greek economy. And then if you add on top of that, just the persistent hesitancy and actually resistance to restructuring the debt, to renegotiating the debt, that actually created so much uncertainty and nervousness amongst investors that the funding position was just untenable. And the rates were prohibitive for such a long time, and it was very protracted in that way. And then when they did restructure the debt, it was the largest restructuring in history, the debt restructuring in 2012, 200 billion. In the end of the crisis, it was 330 billion. So that was 150% of Greece's GDP, over 150% of Greece's GDP. So it was quite a crisis, and it was quite protracted, owing to these pitfalls. And I think if we draw out lessons from Greece's experience, we mentioned the role of central banks and the monetary sort of anchoring. I think now, looking back, the monetary framework that was in place under the EU was really instrumental in anchoring inflation. I think Greece would have had a tremendous inflation problem had they not been part of the European Union, the Euro area. And the central bank governor in particular, who is actually still in place at the moment, that part of the monetary mechanism, they did a really good job in taking the non-performing loans off of the balance sheets of the banks, securitizing them, and just reinvigorating the credit mechanism in the economy. It took a while, but that mechanism really helped get the economy back on its feet. So there are green shoots, sort of 15 years on. I think they exited the third bailout in 2018, so it's almost a decade on. There are green shoots in the recovery. There are multiple engines of growth in the Greek economy. And it's not just, tourism. The service sector growth in multiple fronts is doing quite well. Particularly, and I think this is the key lesson, they targeted certain sectors. So when it came to economic transformation, they targeted digitalization, high tech, industrial, certain sectors in industry, microelectronics. There was a very targeted focus on fostering growth in certain sectors. And Greece is in the middle, I believe, in the digital revolution. So the e-commerce is booming, and it has created both jobs and consumption in the economy. So I think, that anchoring of the monetary mechanism and fostering targeted transformation in certain sectors was very important in Greece. I'll leave it there, and then we can pick up in the discussion.
Thank you. I think I mean, these are tremendous numbers, like GDP falling by 25%. I think Sri Lanka was 7%, wasn't it? And bailout 150% of GDP, and I think that debt to GDP in Sri Lanka is 95 or 100%. So these are tremendous numbers. But interesting to sort of say that there are green shoots there. So think about the high tech sector, and the question is, I suppose, could it have happened a bit earlier? I mean, Sri Lanka also had the luck of tourism numbers going up. Could it have been done earlier?
I think it could have been done earlier. And also one thing that happened as a result of the crisis was privatization. So many of the industries were privatized, which there was something that didn't happen, and over in the run up to the crisis. And then privatization actually catalyzed record FDI into the country. And so that was really a positive catalyst for the economy, because when they did finally privatize certain things, FDI just flowed in, and there's a very vibrant startup community in Greece now, in Athens and things. So that could have come earlier, the privatization, but there was a lot of political gridlock around that happening.
Okay. And the other thing I think you highlighted was really important is pragmatism, need for pragmatism, because that wasn't there necessarily,
No.
and that prolonged the crisis as well. It's just get you further into the crisis. Good. So I hope that Andrew is online, because we'd like to hear also on African economies. We work a lot with African economies in our work at ODI. Work with Tanzania, with Kenya, with a range of other countries, including on macroeconomic issues. But we also hear about defaults that so in Ethiopia, in Zambia, in Ghana, over the last 5 years or 6 years or so. And so we want to hear a bit more about debt vulnerabilities, and also how countries are coming out of the crisis, and perhaps also maybe what the World Bank's experience is on this, and also in terms of supporting countries to transform their economies. So Andrew, over to you. I hope you've been able to hear the discussion so far, and I'd like to hear your take on African economies.
Thank you, and good afternoon to all of you. Can you hear me?
Perfectly well, thank you.
Oh, excellent. So unlike my fellow panelists, I'm not going to speak on just one country. So I'm trying to turn the lights on so you can see me. I'm going to talk a little bit about a regional experience, but maybe in the process of that conversation, we can talk about specific countries if people are interested. So let me take you back to the beginning of this century, 2000. So Africa's growth, this was a period when Africa as a region across the board experienced some reasonably moderate levels of growth, right? So this is one of the longest runs in the continent where growth was averaging around 5% for almost 1.5 decades, right? And so this was one of the, this is considered basically one of the best period of performance in terms of growth in the region. And then commodity, price collapse happened around 2014-15, and the growth basically went south. So there was massive contraction in the region because a lot of these countries are commodity dependent for exports and for large shares of their income. And then subsequent to that is basically this series of shocks. Then COVID hit, Ukraine, inflation. And then the need to protect, of course, the businesses and households. Now, at the beginning of the decade, around 2010, the region actually began with a significantly strong and positive fiscal space, right? So debt to GDP ratios are around 20-30%, right? And so they were able to actually use that to be able to deal with these shocks that were buffeting these economies. But immediately, soon after that, there was a decade of this debt boom in the continent, right? So, you get almost a doubling of debt to GDP ratios from around, 30% to about 56% now. And that has led to substantial problems in terms of basically having the fiscal space to invest in changing these economies. So what you get is you begin from a place where these countries had, a basically low debt region to a place where they're now really lots of them are either in debt distress, leading up to, in fact, defaults for some, to high risk of debt distress. So half the countries, about 23 countries out of 48, basically became almost immediately either in debt distress or high risk of debt distress, right? Now, the debt levels have begun to stabilize, right? In the meantime, what was happening while this debt boom was happening is that, there was this huge change in the composition of creditors, right? So we have, the typical bilateral and multilateral creditors like the World Bank, African Development Bank, and a bunch of other domestic African institutions like Afrexim Bank. And at the same time, there was this entrance of private creditors, right? So these firms that were issuing Eurobonds, private financial markets, as well as other private creditors, and China, of course, right? So in fact, the composition of credit has changed substantially. And as Ganesh was talking about, this complicated basically the way in which debt resolution can be handled, right? It became the incentives for these actors became completely incompatible for some of the countries that actually ended up defaulting. But now, meanwhile, the nature of the economies in general did not structurally change, right? There wasn't massive structural transformation. In the context of this debt boom and constrained fiscal space, you also have this massive jobs challenge in the region, right? The demographics basically comes into collision with the economic situation that the countries find themselves, right? So you have, a working age population that is rapidly expanding. You have firms, you have a job that is basically led by small firms that are not capable of specialization, technology adoption, that don't seem to actually absorb, labor and increase productivity. And so you have a growth that is recovering, right? We begin to see now growth recovering, and it's remaining firm and steady, right? So we've begun to, the last 2-3 years now, growth has returned back to what it was at the beginning of the century, right? Around 4.4%. That's what we are forecasting. But we still have this debt overhang because even though debt has stabilized, debt servicing costs remain extremely high. Between 20 and 30% of revenues are now, the median is now around 20%. So half of the countries spend about 20% of their revenues servicing debt. The other half, half of the countries spend more than 20% servicing debt. The other half less than that. But it is extremely high. And so that basically means that almost 20 countries right now spend more on debt servicing than basically spending on education and health combined, right? So that's the kind of constraint that these countries are facing, even though, in fact, growth is recovering. So part of the reason why growth has recovered, just as a point to note, is because these countries have been able, because of what's going on at the international level with the Fed, with the European Central Bank, and so on, and reduction in interest rates, inflation has come down. So they've been able to control inflation. Macroeconomic stabilization has kind of taken hold. And so stabilization at this period was the most important thing for these countries to do during this debt boom and this series of crises. Now is when they're really thinking about how to do the next round of reforms in order to be able to structurally change their economies. And part of what they're really, really focusing on now are things like how do you mobilize resources domestically? How do you go back to the market, have market access? That remains a challenge. It's only actually available to credit-worthy countries. And even though for the credit-worthy countries, the cost is very high. Because in fact, the basis, even though the basis is the same, right? Like the premium that they pay is the same, about 4% above what US used to get, but the US base rate has actually increased it has doubled, right? So while they used to be able to get about 5 to 6% interest rate, now they're getting 8 or so percent, right? So it's extremely costly, even for those who have credit. So this is the challenge these countries are now facing, right? They don't have access to credit, otherwise it is costly. They don't have public fiscal space. And so the only thing that is left for them is basically to try to think about domestic resource mobilization for these massive investments that are needed in order to basically reduce poverty, grow and change the structures of this economy to reduce poverty and create jobs at scale. So let me stop here and then we can take that up.
Okay, thanks, Andrew. Thank you for that. That's I think is an interesting story that you tell about the debt boom, not sort of consistent with any changes in structural changes. So there's no structural change happening, structural transformation, economic transformation happening, or at least not enough to justify the increase in debt. Let me sort of summarize what we've heard, and then go to the debate. So I think there are sort of three areas that we need to talk about. First of all, it's about debt management, and there are still issues there. We've heard about the complexity of the borrower landscape, the creditor landscape. We heard it from Andrew, we heard it from Ganesh as well. And we also heard that countries have dealt with this differently. I think Ganesh said there's pragmatism in the case of Sri Lanka, that there has been support from multilateral institutions like the IMF, from India as well. And they've sort of managed that in that way. In other cases, it's been a bit more protracted. In the case of Greece, for example. So debt management. So if you go from debt to transformative growth, the title of the meeting, I think debt management is the first item, and there we need to maybe discuss a bit more on what are the lessons, and also for countries that are going through it now. And secondly, it's around sort of macroeconomic stabilization and a growth recovery. So I think interestingly that Andrew also mentioned about growth in Africa. That's now increasing. In fact, actually, I've mentioned that previously in other meetings, but it's forecast to be higher this next year in Africa than it is in Asia or than in China, for example. So it's actually much faster, but of course, per capita population growth is also pretty fast. But at least there's some growth. We've got growth recovery, albeit with some debt overhang. But in going to recovery and going to the position of growth, there are issues that we need to think about, like the Chilean example about fiscal and monetary sort of coordination. How do you do that? And what is the timing of this? What is the content of each of the policies, when, and so on? That seems to be like a really important area. Also, you mentioned initial conditions are important. So, of course, if you've got more reserves, it's easier to deal with a shock, and then you can get. It's more easy to go into a V shape. I want to learn also a bit more from the Sri Lanka example. What caused this V? Is it tourism? Was it the debt, the finance injection? And is it possible now to do the technology emphasis that maybe that Phyllis was talking a bit about? And that's perhaps the third area that we talk about, is the structural transformation. So we haven't seen enough of that in African economies. I'd like to hear from Andrew at some point also whether there are differences in amongst African countries. He said that they're waiting for the next round of reforms, domestic resource mobilization, maybe their trade angle as well, something that we're trying to do in the Sri Lanka case. So those are the three areas I think that we can draw out. So what lessons on debt management, questions on that, thinking about recovery. It's happening in many countries, but we've got lessons to talk about. But there are many countries still folks are challenged by going towards more structural transformation, and how do you do that is something to discuss. So I'd like to bring in the audience as well, and there's also an online audience. So I'll look at my iPad as well. But maybe there are people who want to bring in various perspectives on the question of going from debt to transformative growth, and it might also be issues that we haven't talked about. So Laura, for example, we haven't really talked about climate change in all of this, and climate bonds, and maybe you also want to start with that as well, to think, well, what is the role of debt swaps, and this maybe you want to. Is there a microphone?
Thank you, Dirk. Laura Kelly from the International Institute for Environment and Development. Really interesting to hear the discussion here today. Economic transformation really key, and actually really challenging with what's going on in the Gulf at the moment. That also brings in the climate dimension, I think, quite strongly. We've been working at IID in the last couple of years, a potential tool to support the sort of, the different debt management options that you might have, or how you might look at transforming your economy. And we looked at the sort of the old idea of debt for climate and nature swaps, and we worked with Stephanie on this. But recognizing some of the challenges of countries getting into debt on sustainability in the first place, often money wasn't used for the right sort of things, the things that it was designated for. So some of the economic transformations that should have happened didn't. So trying to build on that and looking at the climate and nature issues, obviously Sri Lanka, tourism really key, that's dependent on nature very often, and climate also plays a role. So we came up with this idea of trying to tie debt relief to not expenditure in climate and nature, but in achieving certain indicators, so sort of key performance indicators around, say, installing renewable energy capacity or conserving your marine environment. We supported Cabo Verde in West Africa to do a swap with the government of Portugal along those lines. And we've just started a new project with the UN Economic Commission for Africa. So I'd be interested, what Andrew's saying about the African countries dealing with the debt overhang. That's what we're hearing. They're looking for innovative tools. The bigger debt management issue is something that's really important, and I think governments are committed to. But how they're actually going to get the resources for this economic transformation. Those poorer countries in Africa that don't have access to markets, they're seeing aid volumes decline as well. So it would be interesting to get the panel's perspectives on the sort of broad range of innovative finance instruments, and where, for some of particularly the lower income countries, where are they going to get the resources to really help keep these reforms on track. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So there's also one or two questions online, so let me also take those. Though I think it's really important that we maybe come back to this issue as well, and maybe Andrew heard it about the question on debt overhang. I suppose not all economic transformation support is resource intensive, but much might be. And I don't know what happened in the case of Greece in terms of the technology factors, whether there's been resources were needed or whether it's a matter of reforms. The questions online are so from Gunnel from the Church of Sweden, and she's asking about social spending, whether social spending has been reduced, protected in the processes you've described. So that's, of course, that is a huge challenge, a social problem, also in the case of Sri Lanka, for example. Wanted to hear also from that in the case of Chile. So what's the long-term impact of that on growth? So whether the social spending has been reduced, protected. And then the second question is around multipliers. So Phyllis mentioned the multipliers of austerity in Greece and in Chile and Sri Lanka. To what extent has social spending been decreased, protected in the process you described? And what impact do you see of that on long-term growth? I think the multiplier issue is an important one. I'd like to hear the panel on that as well, because so sometimes in IMF debt sustainability frameworks, there isn't much attention to different fiscal multipliers. And so and if you underestimate fiscal multipliers by a large amount, then a contraction will bring you more problems rather than fewer problems. And I think during the global financial crisis, we were underestimating the fiscal multipliers by a large amount, and there's a literature on that, and so maybe that's also something to think about fiscal multipliers, social spending. And then a final question before we go to the panel, unless there's some others here in the room as well. Jeremy Holmes, very interesting. I don't think there was any mention of inward FDI. What do you think about that as an instrument to promote growth? Is it a valuable instrument? How can it be achieved? So if you're in a crisis, maybe the FDI will leave the country. But if you want to move to structural transformation, how important is inward FDI in the case of Chile? How important has it been in the case of Greece, in Sri Lanka, and also in the case of African countries? So shall we first go to Stephanie? You can take some of this point and anything else you'd like to respond to, and then we go to the other panelists.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Very interesting questions. I mean, I felt I should have said maybe 2 points that I didn't say because of time, and which came up a bit from the other panelists. One is that, of course, the period that I was analyzing and that I lived through was like in Sri Lanka, left-wing government, but it was very seriously constrained by the fact that, firstly, it had inherited this big macroeconomic imbalances that I described. So it had very little fiscal space. And secondly, it had no control of either house of the parliament. So they couldn't achieve any increase in taxes, direct taxes, because traditionally the right in Chile never votes for increases in direct taxes. So it was very resource constrained, the kind of things it wanted to do, which of course limited its ability to do structural transformation, investment, and increase social spending. I think it defended social spending quite well, but it certainly couldn't increase it as much as it would have liked, which was also, of course, a big problem. It did do some things in terms of, for example, because there's also the opportunities. Chile is ideally placed, like many developing countries actually, for a green transition, for a low carbon transition, because Chile has copper, which is absolutely essential for electromobility and for green energy. It has lithium, largest reserves in the world of lithium at relatively low cost, because you don't have to crack it out of the rock, but you get it out of salaris, I forget the name in English, which is cheaper. And it has huge potential, like many developing countries, in green hydrogen, for example, also very much in demand. So I think there is a great potential, and I think the previous government did huge steps, in some cases building on the previous right-wing government, not extreme like this one, the new one, on, for example, developing green hydrogen. And so I think there were important steps like a public-private agreement to increase the production of lithium, a huge effort on that. That's the kind of things you can do when you're fiscally constrained, even when you're fiscally constrained. And the other thing that has happened, that FDI, which is another of your questions, actually increased very significantly. Practically all this increase that I mentioned of 7% was all foreign direct investment. And I think that has less to do, although it's not not what the politicians say, less to do with the government in turn. There has to be a certain stability of the rules, which there was. Actually, the royalty was increased during this government, the previous government, but with very clear rules. And so foreign investors felt there were clear rules. But the main thing is that there is these resources and that there was high demand for it. So it's very nice for politicians to say, oh no, it's us who's causing it. But in fact, it depends on also on a stable macro framework, but also on the resources that you have and the facilities you give to implement. An interesting thing that was done by, a bit unusual for a left-wing government, was that they lowered the barriers for permits, because the big issue in Chile was, as in many countries, what they call permisología, which means that it takes ages to get a project approved because of different environmental, social, native people restrictions. And this has been speeded up, I think, without a cost to protecting the environment, which is very important. I think the new government will probably continue that, which is good, but I fear that it will continue it by also degrading the level of standards, which is not good, which is very bad. And another thing is, if I may, on debt relief, I think that two things. One is sort of for poorer countries. I think that unfortunately the climate for granting debt relief will be seriously eroded by all the aid cuts and all the increase in priority in defense. And so it may be perhaps in the margin slightly easier to get new money, even new public money. And on private flows, I'm rather skeptical of the value of private flows, like portfolio flows and short-term credit as a way of funding investment in particularly in low-income countries. And unfortunately, it's the case, the historical case, that I remember being on a similar panel here with somebody from an African country, and I said this, and she looked very offended. But sadly, it's a country that has had to default. So I think, the temptation to having especially short-term money at variable interest rates, I think is very dangerous. FDI is different. The FDI is different broadly, and long-term money is more valuable. Although we did some empirical research in this project led by Victor Murinda, and even FDI didn't seem to have clear growth effects. Yeah. But certainly not short-term money. Yeah.
Very, very interesting, I think. You see, this area about FDI versus portfolio flows has also come up in a recent roundtable that we had on the G20 and the upcoming UK presidency, and that and there were presentations by major banks basically, and they also saw this trend over the last decade, sort of away from FDI towards more portfolio flows, and gross fixed capital formation as a percent of GDP is not increasing; it's decreasing. And so what you mentioned in Chile is that both gross fixed capital formation was increasing in your first installment, and then FDI was also increasing. That's the sort of situation that you'd like to be in. The other thing I think you mentioned, and I'm turned then to Ganesh, is political stability. So or lack of political stability. So that government inherited some challenges, but also didn't have control of both houses. And I think in Sri Lanka it was a bit of the opposite, wasn't it? So maybe you want to respond to some of the questions.
Sure. So let me take the FDI portfolio question. Historically, Sri Lanka has had underperformance in FDI and also in portfolio investment. And that is a real puzzle. And during the crisis, both these things have been accentuated downwards, right? So last year, for instance, portfolio, there was a net outflow of foreigners from our stock market, which was interesting, even though the recovery was coming. And I think some of that is because people were waiting till the stock market went up a bit to move their money out, right? They were not confident about the long term. And I think this Iran crisis spells a mixed opportunity for portfolio, because we are hoping that it will become a financial hub at some sense, also with an aviation hub and offering a sort of safe haven kind of story. So that's on the portfolio side. FDI has been curious. I mean, we have really underperformed there generally relative to our neighbors and also Southeast Asia. And part of that in the crisis story, we've had a bit of government-linked FDI from India, if you like, in energy and so on. But I think the challenge we have is this left-leaning government story, right? We're worrying about, privatization, for instance, is sort of seen with very kind of tainted lenses. And so they have this idea that they can corporatize loss-making SOEs. Yeah? And I find this fascinating with the airline, for instance, Sri Lankan airline, which is a wonderful airline in many ways. But in India, you've had, Tata's taking a big stake in Air India, and it certainly made that airline very good. PIA in Pakistan has been also privatized in some form. And so Sri Lankan, they're very worried about the entry of British Airways coming in October this year, creating competition with a much better hardware product. And they're thinking, how do we improve our service? But they're not thinking really privatization. So that's fascinating. And I think the logic of this really is that you've got to have the red tape reforms, which they're trying to do digitization. But I think, just digitizing the existing steps that you talked about is not good enough. You have to cut the steps, right? So that whole red tape analysis that we're all aware of, and I've heard so many stories of investors saying, they won't invest because they've had all these problems with work permits, with municipal approvals, with a board of investment that doesn't have the right kind of power. So that set of things around FDI policy is very important. Then, of course, the privatization, I think they have to consider that. And then, we have very low productivity relative to, what other countries in the region has had. And part of the reason, one loves Sri Lanka so much is we have too many holidays. and that's on top of the sort of don't work Monday idea. Monday night people go out and have a great time on Sunday. And then on Monday, they don't come to work. So absenteeism is also a problem. And then we had some barriers also to female labor force stories. So, around that, we have a lot of stuff to do around the reform. So that's the reform thing. And I'll just say one thing about the social spend. So that when the budget was done last November, they increased the amount they would spend because there was a fiscal uptick. The tax to GDP ratio doubled, went back to pre-crisis levels. So they said lots of welfare. And interestingly, the IMF program also protected the social spend, which was very interesting in our IMF program. So the IMF isn't the old IMF of the days that you were writing, Stephanie, and Tony Killock in this place, and Sheila and others, and Dirk maybe were writing about the IMF in the old style. This is a very different IMF. So that's protected, but we have an enviable social welfare system, even by British standards. So there's free education from the point of entry right through to becoming a doctor. That I think, and then you can promptly migrate afterwards. There's no barrier. So I think that's going to be a challenge to maintain that level of welfare relative to the issues we have. And then on the welfare, really, we've got to look. We have very good anti-poverty programs historically, but we have lots of type 1 and type 2 errors, right? So people who should be getting are not getting. And people who shouldn't be getting are getting, and that's partly politicization. So we've got to really rethink some of these things as we move forward. Let me just stop. I've taken far too much. Thank you.
No, I think it's interesting. Also, you mentioned the role of the IMF, and that it's perhaps looked a bit differently in Sri Lanka now. And we also had a meeting here on the geopolitics and finance. I think Marcela was there as well, and also the IMF were saying that we also look into the political economy now. After, for example, the way it dealt with Kenya. And that was really important, so that the whole government had to resign. Yeah.
I mean, I also, having been a critic, long-standing critic, now appreciate the IMF because Chile had a flexible credit line, which actually they paid back, but then we had pressure on the exchange rate, and we wanted to intervene with our own foreign exchange reserves. And we went back to the IMF, and they gave us again this flexible credit line, which is interesting because you don't actually disperse the money, but you know that you have it. And the markets, of course, more importantly, know that you have it. And so, for example, we then spent actually about $7 billion of reserves, which of course lowered our reserves, but to compensate that, we had this bigger credit line.
Yeah.
And that then, helped stabilize the exchange rate, which played a big role in the stabilization effort. So in that sense, the flexible credit line, and I think there is an equivalent for low-income countries, is very valuable.
Yeah.
But it's quite restricted to countries that the IMF considers to have very good macro conditions. So maybe a discussion would be if they could expand it.
Yeah, the conditionality. I mean,
Well,
pragmatism.
the conditionality is actually relatively low.
Yeah,
Yeah, but they require this kind of it's like a seal of approval.
yeah. But I think it's pragmatism with IMF, and IMF needs to have pragmatism with countries.
Exactly.
I think that's what we're thinking about. So that's all. Phyllis, any?
Just a couple of observations, which is, the tool of inward investment in promoting recovery, I think was quite important in Greece's case. So there were clusters of policies that involved multiple stakeholders, like the regulators, the banks, and key institutions, which fostered this inward investment. FDI is still a little bit lumpy, as it always is, but we had major multinationals making investments, in the wake of the recovery, like Microsoft and others setting up investments in the country. And so I think that was quite important, the involvement of multiple stakeholders. So it just wasn't one initiative, but many people were consulted, in preceding the reform, and then bills were passed to just actively promote inward investment. On the point of renewable investments and green industry, I think it's really interesting in Greece because there was this push to promote green industry and to become more sustainable. But there was a phase, and it may have evolved now, that they only pushed certain green initiatives to the extent that they could collect extra tax revenue from it. So it was a sort of a carrot and stick approach, but they were only interested in promoting initiatives that helped them garner more revenue from the particular initiative. So it wasn't, which I thought was very interesting, because they were in a very difficult fiscal position, huge current account deficit, huge fiscal deficit. So there is still this policy leaning towards fiscal conservatism. They're not going to push green initiatives if they don't feel that, that they can gather that more revenue from it. Yeah.
So green shoots with a question mark. Very good. Andrew, over to you. So there were quite a few questions on the social spending, the fiscal multiplier, role of inward FDI, and we talked a bit about political stability. So which ones would you like to take?
Let me take the question on social spending and debt swaps in general, and then inward FDI. So let me just start with inward FDI. So what we notice in the region, in Africa region in particular, is that investments, including FDI, kind of rose at the beginning of this century all the way to about 2014. At the same time that the region was growing, and then it's across the board, right? Public investments, domestic private investment, external foreign investments, FDI, all of them rose, and then they crashed after 2014. So it peaked around 2014, then it crashed, and then some recovery is underway right now. I think as risk perceptions about the region begin to change. But I think the important thing to remember is that it is very concentrated. What we find out is that FDI flows in Africa are very concentrated on sectors and also in countries. So for countries, it is mostly about maybe 4 or 5 countries where a lot of this is concentrated. And that is, South Africa, Kenya, Nigeria, maybe Egypt, DRC, Zambia, around that. And a lot of it is just, and then a lot of it is around three or so sectors, right? It is minerals in particular, oil and gas, these rare, these green technology minerals like copper, cobalt, whatever, nickel. And then it is fintech and energy, maybe, especially distributed renewable energy, right? So that's the pattern that we're beginning to observe. Whether the portfolio investments were quite bullish before the inflation spike in after the war in Ukraine, and then there was a flight to safety, and so I don't think that has completely recovered yet. It's slowly coming back, but it hasn't recovered completely. But the inward, so investments in general are slow in recovery. Now, let me switch to debt management. So I think the way African countries are looking at debt management, it is actually part of their growth strategy. At the moment, they're thinking of it as, there's a big tension going on right now between debt restructuring and active debt management, liability management. And you can see this tension going on between Senegal and IMF, the way the conversation is going at the moment, where Senegal is basically saying, no, we don't want to do debt restructuring. We actually want to do active liability management. And I think part of this is because of the disappointment with how long this common framework that the first movers, the countries that defaulted, Zambia, Ethiopia, Chad, and Ghana, the ones that first defaulted and then went to the international community for debt restructuring, that has been very disappointing in just how long that has taken. In fact, it's 4 years now for Zambia, and they're still lingering unresolved issues, right? So that's the thing that a lot of countries are shy to do, because it is extremely costly in terms of effort, in terms of negotiations, and so on. So a lot of them are opting towards, some way of managing liabilities, or in fact, unfortunately, moving to more domestic borrowing, which is not really a solution, but a risk. Is basically a risk transfer, right? They're transferring risk to the financial market domestically. So what are they doing now? So they're focusing on two things: liability management and basically market access. And the way they're trying to do market access is through guarantees. So what's happening is they'll come to the World Bank, for example, or some other interested party and say, why don't you guarantee some of our debts? Then we will go to the international financial market and actually get favorable rates, right? So this is what people are calling debt for development swaps, right? So these are becoming very attractive. So we've seen this being pushed in Cote d'Ivoire, in Angola, in Benin, and Kenya is actually trying to do that. So a lot of countries are getting very interested in this process of debt for development swaps. The previous development swaps were mostly environmental and climate related, and I think a lot of countries are not. They felt like that they didn't have ownership of that. It was an agenda that was driven mostly by the people who were underwriting these credits and debt. In this particular case, where they have guarantees, especially from MIGA, is where they feel like they can actually go to the market and borrow, and then have some performance indicators that they care about in terms of development, whether it is investing in education, in health, maybe even environmental conservation, but it is out of their choice, not something that is imposed on condition, right? So that's what's important. On protection of the social spending, I think we have to accept that just given the tightness of the fiscal space, some of these countries will not protect all the social spending. So what really matters is, what do you actually protect? And it seems like the most important thing to do is to protect sectors that are going to lead to long-term growth and structural change. So if you change the composition of, given the budget envelope you have there, then you need to spend. You need to change the composition of the spending, so that in fact you don't forget spending on sectors on sectors and investments that are going to give you longer term structural change in the economy. So that I think is how the African countries are now beginning to think. And that is where the next round, the second round of reforms, the structural changes are happening at the moment. So there's a lot of investments going to infrastructure, into skills development, and so on and so on. Let me stop here.
Yeah, very, very important remarks as well around, so what do you protect and sort of the social sectors, but also structural transformation and productivity. And I also read the country economic memorandum and the productivity reports for Zambia, for example, where I think the past efforts weren't really that successful in raising productivity, and the sort of the fiscal multiplier wasn't really high in that case. But now, of course, there's quite a lot of challenges from the past, and how do you haven't got a lot of headroom, but how do you do that? I don't know whether the Zambia High Commission wants to come in at some point on this as well. So I think the importance, there's a lot of sort of debt issues have been dealt with. Many of them have been dealt with, and it's nearly done, isn't it? And I think so there could be some green shoots, and then the issues that how do you actually promote structural transformation now with the limited resources that you've got? Please do come in if you want to. Sheila, you had your hand up. And anybody else also, we're going to go to final questions. I mean, Marcelo is here as well. Think about other Latin American experiences. Chile has been really good, but we've got Argentina as well. I don't know whether Ivan wants to come in, but Sheila.
Thank you, Sheila Page, ODI, I suppose. A couple of questions on a slightly more long-term basis. I'm glad that the last intervention was also looking at the long-term problems. The first is, Stephanie, you put a lot of emphasis on the credibility of the central bank. I mean, you were able to say this is a temporary inflationary, and it's not an inflationary thing, it's a temporary price increase. Effectively, you guarantee it's not going to last, and you therefore do not respond to it. That's a trick a lot of central banks would like to be able to operate, some of them not far from here. How long did it take to develop that credibility, and how risky, what are the risks of how you could lose it? And a second, and Ganesh may want to comment on this as well from the Sri Lankan experience. And the second issue is again, the more long-term structural effects. You said one of the ways that Chile responded to the COVID crisis was allowing people to take pensions early. What are the 30 to 40 year down the line implications of that for incomes and so on? I can't resist saying it's very nice to know that after not even 40 years, the IMF has taken the advice that some of us gave to set up flexible lines of support.
Yeah, Marcelo, and then later.
So IMF stabilization programs are usually successful in bringing short-term stabilization to the country. However, they are typically less successful in really bringing structural long-term reform. The question is, in your experience and perception, is that because of program design, or is it because the IMF is being asked to do something that is beyond its capacity?
Very interesting question.
Hi, I'm Lydia. I'm the debt policy lead at Save the Children. I just wanted to ask a quick question. Obviously, the African Union's common position on debt is calling for changes to the common framework, so standstills, deeper debt relief, clearer timeframes, comparability of treatment. UK legislation would enable all of those, make them fairer and more effective. Obviously, the UK hosting the G20 next year is a clear opportunity to support partner countries, particularly those in Africa, experiencing debt distress. And as the title of this session suggests, that is a clear pathway out of debt crisis into growth. So just interested on the panel's opinions on that.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Great. And there was also one question still online, the final question. Eugene Jonathan from Action Green for Trade and Sustainable Development in Kenya. A question to Andrew. How does the World Bank support developing countries tackle illicit financial flows? Proper dealing with IFFs can lead to great transformative growth. Great, great. So I think we're coming to the end now of the meeting. So I'd like to give just one final say to the panel. So you can sort of have 1 minute to sort of have your final concluding remarks. I think we should probably start with Andrew. So do it in reverse order. Andrew, then Phyllis, and then Ganesh and Stephanie. So Andrew, there were 1 or 2 questions, a few points. Any final remarks you want to make?
Yeah. So I'll take the last 2 points. How to deal with illicit financial flows. So the way the World Bank has, I guess, 2 broad approaches to this. There's one program called STAR, which is a way to actually try and track basically corruptly obtained kind of private gain, collaborating with international financial institutions and try to recover them for the countries. But the countries have to ask for this support, right? So that's one. The second way we do this is to try and work with countries to build capacity to actually monitor and investigate and be able to prevent these illicit financial flows. The third point is to help the financial system to try and make sure that, in fact, that money is not laundered from illicit activities to legitimate activities. So in strengthening the banking system in order to be able to detect and to identify these types of flows, right? So those are some of the ways in which the World Bank works with countries to help them deal with illicit financial flows. The second point is about the common framework. Yes, I think African countries have been calling for this. I think it's not just African. The World Bank and the IMF have also been calling for a fairer, faster, and more effective common framework. The problem is that the common framework has participants whose incentives are not completely aligned. So I think unless there is some effective international sovereign credit resolution mechanism that improves upon the common framework, it's going to be very difficult to get there. So that's what's lacking, right? Something equivalent to a bankruptcy law that we usually get for corporations, for corporate sector, but that we need for the sovereign debt. And that at the moment doesn't have it. There isn't an agreed upon set of criteria and features. But any attempt to try and make this quicker, fairer, and more effective, I think will be helpful for a lot of these countries. Let me put it down. Let me stop there.
Thank you. I mean, that's an important point to raise as well. I think the UK government is quite interested in thinking about debt and NDB reform for its G20 upcoming G20 presidency. So maybe that's an issue also to table. Thank you. Phyllis.
Yeah. I think it's really useful to have a discussion and a debate and of the frame of analysis to include many different countries when we're talking about these issues, because often we either go very broad and general and talk about shocks and things, and then or we just focus on one country often. And so I think it's very useful to talk about different countries when we're talking about especially something like shocks or debt instability, so we can have learnings and takeaways from every country. And now we've did this in the G20 conference that we did, that we're fragmenting. So finance is fragmenting and economics is fragmenting a bit, and we have multiple shocks. And I think there needs to be a heightened cooperation and coordination, especially at the G20 level, to combat these shocks and sort of incoming vulnerabilities. Yeah.
Thank you. I think everybody on the panel was nodding when you said that
countries.
Different countries were.
Yeah.
It was useful to have different countries. Ganesh.
So I think this experience of the mix, the middle income countries, I think is very interesting because they don't have the same types of support such as the common framework which are there. Mm-hmm. And I think Sri Lanka's experience really has brought back to me, if you're on that kind of cusp, right? How do you deal with this? And I think having this very strong central bank, having the IMF, which is more supportive, very important. And on Sheila's point about central bank credibility, so our central bank during the default period leading up to the default lost the credibility. They were talking about homegrown solutions. They said no IMF. They advocating development banking things. They brought people who were trying to tell them about industrial policy being run by the central bank and so on. And luckily, over the last 2 years, I think central bank has got that reputation. So you can lose the reputation very quickly if you have the wrong people at the top in particular, and the thing works like a machine, and it comes from the top. If you have the right people, it can work much better. And I think, you have to kind of buy in from all the staff, but it's very hard if the political pressures go in line with nationalism, which is what we had. And even a central bank law can be repealed, an independent central bank law. So I think a lot of emphasis on awareness raising of why central bank fit is useful, and there are questions about fit, and why credibility is critically important as the regulator, as well as also the guarantee of a financial system that doesn't crash when you have a debt default. And Sri Lanka might go this route of Chile down the line, up, which is what we hope that you've done, or it could do the Argentina-Greece story of the L. And I think the jury is still out in my mind, particularly with these shocks. So I think we've got to really think about how we deal with shocks and reforms in a world which is very unstable. Let me stop.
Maybe the compromise between a V and an L is the U. Maybe let's see if we can get there. Stephanie.
Okay, on debt, I found myself agreeing a lot with the things that Andrew was saying. First, about the urgency of both sufficient and timely debt relief, because I think one of the experience drawn, people by Carmen Reinhardt, who's no radical, she says, the main diagnosis is too little, too late debt relief. So I think that is true. And of course, it is difficult to do that in the current environment. And this kind of way that Andrew mentioned to link it to debt, and also Laura, to debt for nature swaps or debt for social spending, I think makes it somewhat more attractive also for the potential donors. Combined even also with catalyzing a new private flows. I think the Brady plan, going back to the 80s, early 90s, was actually quite successful in generating a market for bonds, which generated a channel for private flows to go to Latin America. In fact, they went too much, and then you had the Mexican peso crisis. But I think the trying to link the flows, particularly to desirable investment, whether it's through new flows or through debt relief, I think is an important way, maybe not so much conceptually, but in political, practical terms. The second point I think was very interesting, the issue of credibility. I think one of the interesting questions that Sheila asked was about the pension fund reforms, the withdrawals in Chile. One of the important effects, the first important negative effect, was that it helped stoke inflation and balance payments. But the other important short-term effect was that it reduced the size of the capital markets. And that was very bad, because Chile had a very deep capital market, which implied low interest rates for long-term credit domestically. And that has been reduced quite significantly, which means higher costs for mortgages and high costs for companies to borrow, which has been very negative, because the proportion of the assets held by pension funds was reduced. And there is the additional long-term problem of how you will fund the future, which of course the politicians don't think about. And I think this is linked to a point that I think is always central to make, is the value and importance of domestic resource mobilization as a sort of rock on which you can build your development. This is what the Asians have done so well, and of course European countries in the past. and it's something I think one has to keep emphasizing. It sounds sort of a bit conservative, but it's also true because you're sheltered from volatility, you're sheltered from foreign exchange risks. It's difficult for low-income countries, of course, but even Korea was very poor when it started having this high savings rate. On the issue of credibility, central bank credibility, I was a little bit of an unusual central banker, I suppose, because I came from this development background. All these bad habits created from IDS and ODI. And so I think credibility is important. I think it's costly to lose it, but you mustn't also go overboard and say, sacrifice excessive cost of adjustment or having high interest rates for too long, for example. So it's a very difficult balance, but that's why, for example, I think in the case of Chile, there's an interesting possible discussion about how quickly you should reduce inflation to the target. Some countries do it in 3 years, Chile does it in 2 years. The Fed doesn't have a time limit. So I think that's interesting. And also this possibility of having employment creation or growth as a second objective. It has some problems, it has some risks, but I think it's important. And also, I think the issue of climate change. I mean, the orthodox position is, central banks don't have a mandate and you don't worry about climate change, which is, I think, completely absurd because climate change will affect your macroeconomic future evolution, and if you don't take account. And also, financial regulators in particular, many of them are central banks, some are not, I think can do quite a lot to encourage private flows to go to low carbon activities.
Yeah, very good.
True.
Thank you so much. And you've done it really well, of course, the managing the price stability, inclusive growth trade-off. Remember the project that you did at ODI 15 years ago? I think you did it. Thanks so much for the wonderful presentation. So thanks, of course, Andrew de Wallen from the World Bank, also for your insights on the many African countries going through, facing debt vulnerabilities, but more growth now, but going to structural change. How can that be done? With your insights was really useful. Phyllis about the Greek green shoots and also the lessons from Greece, really valuable. And Ganesh also from the unfolding Sri Lanka case and those people online and here. So Ganesh has been able to sort of provide us with quite a few presentations over the last 2 to 3 years and giving us updates. And we continue to be very interested in the Sri Lankan case, and particularly sort of in its move to much more economic transformation and more export drive as well. And of course, thanks Stephanie for your insight, fantastic, and also the recent insights from Chile, and also sort of correcting some policy mistakes on the pension side. Really interesting. I think you did say that domestic resource mobilization is really important, but you need to use it well as well. I think, and Andrew also mentioned about DRM as well. Domestic resource mobilization is going to be really important. I think we talked about pragmatism, so that's really important. Pragmatism from the IMF to countries, but also from countries to the IMF. That needs think tanks, it needs advice, it needs independent research, it needs those that can help countries think about that. And it can't be just be done by the IMF with countries. It needs advice from the outside as well, both to the IMF and to the countries. As well, we talked about coordination and credibility, coordination of different types of policies. There's fiscal policies, there's monetary policies. I would also say structural economic transformation policies. So the digital transformation industries or trade industries, they need to be brought into this area as well. And when we had a discussion in Washington a couple of months ago, that there were possible changes in Africa, including in Zambia, I think in Ethiopia, on the energy markets. So during crisis, you can make structural changes, but that too requires a lot of coordination and advice. And then, going towards structural change, I suppose is the one area that we do need to all focus on. It's really important, and that we do that. Now, for the people here, we've got lunch out here, but I would also like to thank the online audience also for the questions. I'd like to take here and a big applause for the panelists. Thank you so much.